Frank Whitmore stopped mid-stride on his porch, coffee mug suspended in trembling hands as Liberty's howl split the October dawn like a funeral dirge. The German shepherd's amber eyes blazed with an urgency he'd never seen, not even during their worst nights when the war dreams came calling. This wasn't her usual morning greeting. This was terror. Liberty bolted toward the tree line, then wheeled back to Frank, her massive frame quivering as she pressed against his legs with desperate force. The mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against weathered boards as memories of search and rescue missions flooded back. Liberty wasn't just agitated. She'd found something. Someone. "Easy, girl," Frank whispered, but his voice cracked with the weight of 25 years carrying ghosts. Liberty's paws drummed against the porch steps, each strike echoing like gunfire in the mountain stillness. She was leading him somewhere he didn't want to go, toward answers he'd spent decades avoiding. What was waiting in those woods? And would Frank survive discovering it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Whitmore Ranch sprawled across 43 acres of Tennessee mountain country, like a faded photograph, its once proud fences sagging under the weight of neglect and time. Frank had inherited the property 6 months ago when his older brother passed, along with debts that made his VA disability check look like pocket change. The main house, built by his grandfather in 1952, still stood solid despite peeling paint and a roof that leaked memories along with rainwater. Frank's daily routine had become a ritual of survival. Dawn brought coffee on the wraparound porch where he could watch the mist rise from Harmony Valley below. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of the jungle, cleaner but no less haunting. His hands, weathered by 68 years and scarred by shrapnel, still trembled when thunder rolled across the mountains. Vietnam had ended 48 years ago, but some wars never truly finish. Liberty had appeared 3 months earlier, limping up the gravel drive with a bullet graze on her left shoulder and eyes that held too much knowledge. No collar, no tags, no owner posting flyers around town. Sheriff Bobby Watson had shrugged when Frank called it in. "Probably dumped by someone who couldn't handle a working dog," he'd said. "You know how it is with these military breeds." But Frank knew better. This wasn't abandonment. This was escape. Liberty moved like a soldier, scanning corners before entering rooms, positioning herself with clear sight lines to all exits. Her German shepherd lineage was evident in every calculated step. But something deeper lurked beneath that black and tan coat. She understood commands Frank had never taught her, responded to hand signals that bypassed language entirely. The town of Harmony Valley, population 1,847 according to the welcome sign, had welcomed their newest resident with typical small-town curiosity. Jenny Mae Campbell, the new kindergarten teacher, had been the subject of considerable speculation since arriving from Nashville 6 weeks ago. Divorced, no children of her own, and carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who'd learned to depend only on herself. Frank had seen her at Clara's diner twice, always sitting alone with a book propped against the salt shaker, stealing glances at the children who sometimes accompanied their parents. There was something familiar about the way she held her shoulders, a particular tilt of her head when she laughed that tugged at memories he'd buried so deep they'd fossilized. The ranch's financial situation grew more desperate each week. Property taxes loomed like storm clouds, and the bank's patience was wearing thin. Frank had considered selling, but where would an old soldier go with nothing but ghosts and a dog who understood him better than most people ever had? Liberty's presence had become the one bright spot in his declining world, a reminder that loyalty still existed in a form pure enough to transcend human failure. The morning Liberty led Frank into the woods started like any other, except it didn't. The German shepherd's behavior had shifted overnight from her usual controlled alertness to something approaching desperation. She paced the porch with military precision, pausing only to fix Frank with those amber eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations he couldn't quite understand. "What's got you worked up, girl?" Frank muttered, pulling on his worn leather jacket. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance a storm was building. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd learned to sense incoming mortars in the Mekong Delta. Liberty whined, a sound Frank had never heard from her before. It was pitched high and urgent, like a radio signal breaking through static. She bounded toward the tree line that bordered his property, then circled back to him, her massive paws drumming against the wooden deck. "All right, all right. Show me what's got you so fired up." Frank grabbed his walking stick and followed Liberty down the familiar path that wound through his back 40. The trail had been there since his grandfather's time, carved by generations of Whitmores who'd hunted these woods. As they walked deeper into the forest, Liberty's agitation intensified. She would dart ahead, disappear behind a cluster of oak trees, then return to Frank's side with increasing urgency. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed. Frank's left knee, courtesy of a piece of shrapnel that had missed his femoral artery by inches, protested with each step. Liberty seemed to understand his limitations, adjusting her pace to match his careful navigation of fallen logs and loose rocks. 20 minutes into their trek, Liberty stopped abruptly. Her ears stood at attention and a low growl rumbled from her chest, not aggressive but warning. Frank felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Southeast Asia. Something was wrong. Through the canopy of red and gold leaves, Frank spotted it. A cabin that shouldn't have been there. The structure sat in a small clearing, weathered gray wood that blended into the forest like it had grown from the earth itself. He'd hunted these woods for decades, knew every deer trail and hunting blind. But this cabin was new to him. Liberty approached the structure with the careful deliberation of a soldier clearing a building. Her nose worked the air, and Frank watched her body language shift from alert to alarmed. She padded around the cabin's perimeter, stopping at a small window on the east side. Frank joined her, his heart hammering against his ribs. The window was partially covered by a tattered curtain, but through the gap he could see movement inside, a flash of blonde hair. A hand pressed against the glass from within. Someone was in there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. Frank's military training kicked in like muscle memory. He assessed the situation with practiced eyes. 1-story structure, probably 2 rooms, single door facing west, windows on 3 sides. The cabin looked old but maintained, which meant it wasn't abandoned. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth led away from the clearing, and Frank could smell the faint odor of propane and something else, something medical, like antiseptic. Liberty positioned herself between Frank and the door, hackles raised. She was protecting him, but from what? Frank approached the window cautiously, staying low and to the side. Through the grimy glass he could see more clearly now. A woman sat on what appeared to be a cot, her wrists bound with rope. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled, and when she turned toward the window, Frank felt the world tilt on its axis. Even through the distortion of dirty glass and 25 years of time, he recognized that face. The shape of her eyes, the way she held her chin when she was frightened. It was identical to features he'd memorized from old photographs, features that belonged to someone he'd tried to forget. The woman was young, probably in her 40s, but she had Sarah's nose, Sarah's delicate hands, Sarah's way of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was nervous. Frank's legs nearly gave out as the impossible truth crashed over him like a wave. This wasn't just any kidnapping victim. This was his daughter, the child he'd never met, whose existence he'd learned about in a letter that arrived 3 days after he'd shipped out for his second tour. The daughter whose mother had died in a car accident when the girl was only 5, whose fate Frank had been too much of a coward to discover. Liberty whined softly beside him, pressing her warm body against his trembling legs. Somehow, impossibly, she had led him to the one person he'd spent 47 years being too afraid to find. Frank's hands shook as he pressed closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The woman inside turned toward the sound, and their eyes met through the grimy pane. Recognition flickered across her face, not of him, but of something familiar, something that made her sit straighter despite her bound wrists. He had to get her out of there. Military instincts warred with paternal panic as Frank circled the cabin, looking for the safest entry point. Liberty shadowed his movements, her ears constantly swiveling to catch any approaching sounds. The front door appeared to be the only way in, secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than the rest of the structure. Frank tested the windows. The one where he'd seen her was painted shut, probably decades ago. The others were too small for either of them to fit through. He returned to the door, examining the lock more closely. It was a master lock, heavy-duty but not impossible to break with the right tools. "I need something to pry this with," he whispered to Liberty, who tilted her head as if considering the problem. Frank searched the immediate area and found a rusted tire iron someone had left leaning against a nearby tree. It would have to do. As he positioned the tire iron against the lock's shackle, a voice from inside the cabin stopped him cold. "Please don't hurt me anymore." The words were muffled by the walls, but clear enough to make Frank's chest tighten. It was a voice he'd never heard before, yet it carried the same cadence as Sarah's, the same slight Tennessee accent that had once whispered his name in the darkness of a Memphis hotel room 48 years ago. "I'm here to help," Frank called softly through the door. "Are you alone in there?" A long pause. Then, "Who are you?" Frank's mouth went dry. "How do you introduce yourself to a daughter who doesn't know you exist?" "My name is Frank Whitmore. I live about a mile from here." "My dog led me to you." "Your dog?" The woman's voice carried a note of confusion. "There's been a dog howling in the distance for days. I thought I was imagining it." Liberty whined softly as if she understood she was being discussed. Frank looked down at her, seeing her in a new light. She hadn't just stumbled across this cabin. She'd been searching for it, drawn by sounds no human ear could detect. "Can you tell me your name?" Frank asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Jenny Mae Campbell. I teach kindergarten in town." A pause. "How long have I been here? What day is it?" Frank's knees nearly buckled. Campbell had been Sarah's maiden name. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. After Sarah died, the girl had probably been raised by Sarah's family, keeping the Campbell name instead of taking his. "It's Wednesday, October 18th, Frank managed. "How long have you been here, honey?" "Since Saturday night, I think. Maybe Sunday morning." "It's hard to tell without windows that open." Jenny Mae's voice was getting stronger, hope creeping in. "Are you police?" "No, but I'm going to get you out of there." Frank applied pressure to the tire iron and the lock's metal groaned in protest. "Can you tell me who did this to you?" I'm not sure I should say. He told me no one would believe me even if I got away." Jenny Mae's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He's someone people trust. Someone important in the community." Frank's blood ran cold. In small towns like Harmony Valley, there were only so many people who fit that description. Mayor, bank president, sheriff, or pastor. The kind of men who wore their respectability like armor while hiding monsters underneath. The lock finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the forest. Frank pushed the door open slowly, Liberty by his side. The interior of the cabin was sparse. a cot, a folding chair, a card table with medical supplies scattered across its surface. Jenny May sat on the cot, her wrists bound with rope that had left raw marks on her skin. When she looked up at him, Frank felt 47 years of guilt and regret crash down like an avalanche. She had Sarah's eyes, green as spring grass, and the same stubborn set to her jaw that Sarah had worn when she was determined not to cry. "You're hurt," Frank said, moving toward her carefully. He didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. "Just rope burns, and I haven't eaten much." Jenny May studied his face as he knelt beside the cot to work on the knots. "You said your name was Whitmore?" Frank's fingers stilled on the rope. "That's right. My mother used to talk about a man named Whitmore. She said he was my father, but that he died in Vietnam before I was born." Jenny May's voice was carefully neutral, but Frank could hear the lifetime of questions underneath. The lie Sarah had told to protect them both, to spare their daughter the knowledge that her father was alive but had chosen not to be part of her life. Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. "Your mother," he began, then stopped. The ropes came free, and Jenny May rubbed her wrists gingerly. "She died when I was 5. Car accident. I was raised by my grandmother." Jenny May stood slowly, testing her balance. "But you're not dead, obviously." Liberty approached Jenny May cautiously, tail wagging low. To Frank's amazement, his daughter reached out without hesitation to stroke the dog's head. "She's beautiful," Jenny May said. "What's her name?" "Liberty." Frank watched the interaction, noting how naturally Liberty responded to her touch. "She's the one who found you. Then I owe her my life." Jenny May looked back at Frank, and he saw recognition dawning in her eyes. "You have the same nose as me, the same hands." The truth hung between them like morning mist, fragile and transformative. Frank opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of an engine approaching through the woods cut him off. Someone was coming back. The engine sound grew closer, and Frank's military instincts kicked into overdrive. He grabbed Jenny May's arm gently but urgently. "We need to get out of here, now." "Wait," Jenny May whispered, pulling back toward the cabin. "There's something you need to know about who did this to me. It's Pastor David Thornfield from First Baptist. He's been—" "Tell me while we move," Frank interrupted, his ears tracking the approaching vehicle. Liberty was already at the cabin door, hackles raised, every muscle in her body coiled for action. They slipped out the back of the cabin just as Frank heard car doors slamming in the front clearing. Jenny May stumbled slightly, her legs weak from days of captivity, but Frank steadied her with one arm while gripping his walking stick with the other. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover. Liberty flanked them, moving with the silent precision of a trained military dog. As they crouched behind the rocks, Frank could hear voices approaching the cabin. 2 men, maybe 3. One voice rose above the others, and Frank's blood chilled as he recognized Pastor David Thornfield's distinctive baritone, the same voice that had delivered Sunday sermons to half the county for the past 15 years. "She can't have gotten far," Thornfield was saying. "The lock was broken from the outside." "Someone found her." "Maybe it was just hikers," another voice suggested. Frank didn't recognize this one. "No," Thornfield's voice had taken on a harder edge. "Someone was specifically looking. Check the tracks around the cabin. See if you can figure out which direction they went." Jenny May pressed closer to Frank, and he could feel her trembling. In the filtered sunlight, he could see bruises on her arms that hadn't been visible in the cabin's dim interior. His jaw clenched with a rage he hadn't felt since Vietnam. "He took me Saturday night after the church potluck," Jenny May whispered, her lips barely moving. "I was walking to my car alone. He said he'd been watching me, that I reminded him of someone. His son." Frank's chest tightened. He knew about Thornfield's son. Tommy had died in a car accident 3 years ago, and the pastor had never been quite the same since. The whole community had rallied around him during his grief. But maybe that grief had twisted into something darker. "Found tire tracks," one of the other men called out. "Looks like they went south toward the old logging road." Frank knew they were talking about the path that led back toward his ranch. They had maybe 10 minutes before the search party would start combing the woods in their direction. "We can't outrun them," Frank whispered to Jenny May. "My knee won't hold up for a long chase, and you're too weak from being captive." He studied the terrain around them, his mind working through tactical options. "But I know these woods better than they do." Liberty had been lying flat against the ground, but now she lifted her head, ears swiveling toward a sound Frank couldn't yet hear. A moment later, he caught it too, another vehicle approaching, this one from a different direction. "That's Sheriff Watson's truck," Frank murmured, recognizing the distinctive rumble of the old Ford's engine. Hope flickered in his chest. Bobby Watson was a good man, a straight shooter who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to wear a badge. But as the sheriff's truck pulled into the clearing, Frank's hope curdled into dread. Thornfield's voice carried clearly through the trees. "Bobby, thank God you're here. We found evidence that Jenny May Campbell was being held in this cabin, but whoever took her moved her before we could mount a rescue." Frank felt Jenny May stiffen beside him. The sheriff was being fed lies, and there was no way to warn him without revealing their position. "Any idea who might have taken her?" Sheriff Watson's voice was professional, controlled. "I hate to say it," Thornfield replied, and Frank could hear the false sorrow in his tone. "But I saw Frank Whitmore's truck parked at the end of the logging road about an hour ago. You know how he's been since he came back to town. The war did things to his mind, and with the ranch failing—" "Frank?" Sheriff Watson sounded genuinely surprised. "That doesn't sound like him. Frank's one of the good ones." "I wish I could believe that," Thornfield said. "But he's been acting strange lately, talking to that dog of his like it's a person. And Jenny May is young, attractive. A lonely old man might get ideas." Frank's vision went red around the edges. The pastor was not only covering up his own crimes, but actively framing Frank for them. It was a masterful manipulation, play on the community's fears about damaged veterans while painting himself as the concerned citizen trying to help. Jenny May grabbed Frank's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. She was shaking with rage now, not fear. "He's lying," she whispered, so quietly Frank had to strain to hear her. "I've been trying to expose him for months. He's been abusing children in his congregation, using his position as a counselor to—" Her voice broke and she took a shuddering breath. "One of my students, a little girl named Lucy Morrison, told me things no 5-year-old should know. When I started asking questions, Pastor Thornfield said I was imagining things, that I was just a bitter woman taking out my anger on a godly man." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Jenny May hadn't been randomly kidnapped. She'd been silenced before she could expose Thornfield's abuse. And now the pastor was using Frank as a convenient scapegoat, knowing that a traumatized veteran would make a believable suspect. "We need to get back to the ranch," Frank whispered. "I've got a landline there and my old service rifle. If we can call for help and hold out until—" "No!" Jenny May's voice was firm despite her weakness. "If we run, it just makes you look guilty. Sheriff Watson is a good man, I can tell from the way he talks. We need to take the chance and reveal ourselves." Frank wanted to argue, but Liberty made the decision for them. The German shepherd suddenly stood and began walking toward the clearing, her tail held high and her posture confident. She wasn't acting like a dog trying to escape. She was acting like a dog bringing help. "Liberty, no!" Frank hissed, but it was too late. The dog had emerged from their hiding spot and was approaching the group of men with her head held high. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Watson said. "That's Frank's dog. Where'd you come from, girl?" Liberty walked directly to the sheriff and sat at his feet, looking up at him with those intelligent amber eyes. Then she turned and barked once in the direction where Frank and Jenny May were hidden. "She's trying to tell us something," Sheriff Watson said, his hand dropping to scratch behind Liberty's ears. "Frank trains his dogs well. This one's trying to lead us somewhere." Frank knew they were out of options. He helped Jenny May to her feet, and together they stepped out from behind the boulders. "Bobby," Frank called out, his hands raised to show he wasn't armed, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The effect on the group was immediate. Thornfield took a step backward, his face going pale. The two men with him, Frank recognized them now as church deacons, moved to flank the pastor protectively. "Frank?" Sheriff Watson's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but he didn't draw it. "What are you doing out here? And is that Jenny May Campbell with you?" "It's a long story, Bobby," Frank said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "But the short version is that Pastor Thornfield here kidnapped Miss Campbell and held her in that cabin for 4 days. "That's ridiculous," Thornfield sputtered. "I'm the one who found evidence of her captivity. I'm the one who called you for help." "After I broke the lock and freed her," Frank replied. "Jenny May, tell the sheriff what you told me." Jenny May stepped forward, and Frank could see her summoning strength from somewhere deep inside. "Sheriff Watson, Pastor Thornfield has been sexually abusing children in his congregation. When I tried to report it, he kidnapped me to keep me quiet." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "He's been holding me in that cabin since Saturday night, telling me that no one would believe a divorced woman over a respected man of God." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank watched the sheriff's face, seeing the moment when professional skepticism gave way to careful consideration. Bobby Watson hadn't survived 2 tours in Iraq by ignoring his instincts, and those instincts were clearly telling him that something was very wrong with this situation. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Campbell," Sheriff Watson said finally. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" "Lucy Morrison," Jenny May said immediately, "and probably others who were too scared to come forward. Pastor Thornfield has been using private counseling sessions to—" "Enough!" Thornfield's composure finally cracked. "I won't stand here and listen to these lies from a woman who's clearly been traumatized. Look at her, Bobby. She's been held captive for days by this unstable veteran. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Sheriff Watson was looking at Thornfield now, really looking at him. And Frank could see the exact moment when the lawman noticed what Frank had seen, the guilt written in every line of the pastor's body language. "David," Sheriff Watson said quietly, "why don't you tell me exactly how you found this cabin?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Frank watched Thornfield's face cycle through emotions, surprise, calculation, then a desperate kind of rage that Frank recognized from men who'd been cornered with no way out. I received an anonymous tip," Thornfield stammered, glancing between the sheriff and his 2 deacons. "Someone called the church office and said they'd seen suspicious activity in these woods." Sheriff Watson's expression didn't change, but Frank caught the slight shift in his posture, the way a cop positions himself when he's starting to smell lies. "What time was this call, David?" "Early this morning, around 6, maybe 6:30. "Funny thing about that," Sheriff Watson said, pulling out his notebook. "My dispatcher logs all calls that come into emergency services. We also monitor church and community center phone lines as part of our safety protocol. No calls were logged to First Baptist between midnight and 8 a.m. this morning." Frank felt Jenny May's hand slip into his as they watched Thornfield's carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. Liberty had positioned herself between the group and the pastor, her stance alert but not aggressive. She was reading the situation like the trained military dog she'd once been. "Maybe it was my personal line," Thornfield said, his voice taking on a higher pitch. "Or perhaps I misremembered the time. The important thing is that we found evidence of Miss Campbell's captivity, and we have the man responsible right here." He pointed an accusing finger at Frank, but the gesture lacked conviction. One of the deacons, Frank recognized him as Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, was staring at his pastor with growing confusion. "Pastor," Bradley said slowly, "if you got a tip about Jenny May being held in these woods, why didn't you call the sheriff first? Why bring us out here armed like we're some kind of militia?" Frank noticed for the first time that both deacons were carrying hunting rifles. That wasn't standard procedure for a rescue mission. That was the equipment of men who expected to shoot someone. Sheriff Watson noticed too. "David, why don't you and your friends set those rifles down real careful-like? This is starting to feel less like a rescue and more like a hunting party." "Now see here, Bobby," Thornfield blustered, but his authority was evaporating like morning dew. "I'm an ordained minister and a pillar of this community. I won't be treated like some common criminal." "Then start acting like a minister," Sheriff Watson replied, his hand now resting openly on his service weapon. "Because right now, you're acting like a man with something to hide." Jenny May stepped forward, and Frank marveled at her courage. After 4 days of captivity, facing down the man who'd terrorized her should have been impossible. But she stood straight, her chin raised in defiance. "Sheriff Watson, there's something else you need to know. Pastor Thornfield didn't just kidnap me to silence me about the abuse allegations. He's been planning this for weeks, maybe months." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "He told me during my captivity that he'd been watching me, studying my routines. He knew exactly when I'd be alone after the church potluck." "That's enough!" Thornfield's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about, you barren, bitter woman. You're just jealous of the love and respect I command in this community." The words hit Jenny May like a physical blow, and Frank felt her flinch. But then her spine straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd found her strength. "Tommy Thornfield died 3 years ago," she said, addressing Sheriff Watson, "a 17-year-old boy full of life and promise. But did you know that Tommy had been trying to tell people about his father's behavior before he died? Did you know that car accident happened the same night Tommy had finally worked up the courage to report his father to Child Protective Services?" The silence that followed was profound. Frank could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of wind through autumn leaves, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of approaching thunder. The storm that had been building all day was finally drawing near. "You're lying," Thornfield whispered, but all the fight had gone out of him. "Tommy loved me. He would never—" "Tommy loved you enough to try to get you help," Jenny May said, and her voice was gentle now, almost pitying. "But when you found out what he was planning, you couldn't let him destroy your reputation, so you followed him that night, didn't you? You caused that accident." Frank watched the pastor's face as the accusation sank in. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers who'd done things they couldn't live with. It was the expression of a man staring into the abyss of his own actions. "He was going to ruin everything," Thornfield said, his voice barely audible. 40 years of ministry, of helping people, of serving God. He was going to throw it all away over misunderstandings, a few moments of weakness that didn't mean anything. Sheriff Watson was already reaching for his handcuffs, but Frank held up a hand to stop him. Something in the pastor's demeanor suggested this confession was far from over. And when Jenny May started asking the same questions Tommy had asked, "You decided she needed to be silenced too," Frank said, his voice hard as granite. Thornfield looked up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "You don't understand. None of you understand. I've done so much good for this community. I've baptized children, married couples, buried the dead. A few mistakes don't erase a lifetime of service." "A few mistakes." Jenny May's voice cracked like a whip. You molested children, David. You killed your own son to cover it up. And you would have killed me too if Frank hadn't found me. I wasn't going to kill you, Thornfield protested, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I just needed time to think, to figure out how to make you understand that exposing me would hurt more people than it would help. Frank felt a cold rage building in his chest. How many others, Thornfield? How many other children did you hurt? The pastor's shoulders sagged in defeat. I don't know. Over the years, maybe a dozen, maybe more. I tried to stop, but the temptation was always there, and my position gave me access. One of the deacons, the other man Frank now recognized as Jeff Morrison, whose daughter Lucy was one of Jenny May's students, made a sound like a wounded animal. His rifle clattered to the ground as he staggered backward. "Lucy," Morrison whispered. "Oh, God, Lucy. That's why she's been having nightmares. That's why she won't let me hug her anymore." Sheriff Watson finally moved, stepping forward with his handcuffs ready. "David Thornfield, you're under arrest for kidnapping, child sexual abuse, and suspected murder. You have the right to remain silent." But Thornfield wasn't listening to the Miranda warning. His attention was fixed on Frank, and there was something calculating in his gaze that made Frank's skin crawl. "You think you're so righteous," Thornfield said, his voice taking on a preacher's cadence despite the circumstances. "But what about your sins, Frank Whitmore? What about the daughter you abandoned before she was even born?" Frank felt Jenny May's sharp intake of breath beside him. The secret he'd carried for 47 years was about to be exposed in the worst possible way. "That's right," Thornfield continued, a twisted smile playing at his lips. "I know all about your shameful past. Sarah Campbell came to me for counseling when she was pregnant and alone. She told me about the soldier who'd promised to marry her and then disappeared into the jungle. She died thinking you were already dead, but I knew better." "Stop," Frank said. But his voice came out as barely a whisper. "I've known who Jenny May really was from the moment she arrived in town. Do you want to know the beautiful irony? She's been searching for her father her entire life, attending churches and community events, hoping to find some connection to the man who abandoned her. And all this time he's been living just a few miles away, too much of a coward to claim his own blood." Jenny May turned to look at Frank, her green eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "Is it true? Are you really my father?" The thunder was getting closer now, and Frank could smell rain in the air. The storm that had been building all day was about to break, just like the fragile world they'd all been living in. "Yes," Frank said, the word torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "God help me, yes. I'm your father, and I've been too ashamed to tell you." The clearing erupted in chaos as the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the forest floor into a slippery maze of mud and fallen leaves. In the chaos that followed Frank's confession, Thornfield made his move. The pastor lunged toward one of the dropped rifles, his desperation giving him a burst of adrenaline that caught everyone off guard. "Nobody's taking me alive!" Thornfield screamed, his hands closing around the weapon. "I won't rot in prison for doing what felt natural, what God himself programmed into men." Sheriff Watson drew his service weapon, but the rain and confusion made for poor shooting conditions. "Put it down, David. Don't make this worse than it already is." Frank instinctively moved to shield Jenny May, but she was staring at him with an expression of profound shock and hurt that cut deeper than any physical wound. The revelation of their relationship, delivered as a weapon by a desperate man, had stolen what should have been a moment of connection and turned it into another trauma. 47 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "You've been alive for 47 years and you never once tried to find me." "Jenny May, Frank began, but Thornfield's voice cut through everything else. "That's right, Frank. Tell her how you read about Sarah's death in the newspaper and felt nothing but relief. Tell her how you chose your guilt over your daughter year after year, because it was easier than being a man." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Frank felt something break inside his chest, a dam that had been holding back decades of self-loathing and regret. Because Thornfield was right. Frank had felt relief when he'd learned Sarah had died. Relief that his secret would die with her, that he'd never have to face the consequences of his cowardice. Liberty, who had been standing guard between the humans and the tree line, suddenly erupted into motion. She launched herself at Thornfield just as he swung the rifle toward Frank, her 90 pounds of muscle and bone hitting the pastor like a furry missile. The rifle discharged into the air, the crack of gunfire echoing through the forest. But Thornfield wasn't finished. As he fell backward, he managed to twist the rifle around, pointing it directly at Liberty's chest. Time slowed to a crawl as Frank watched the pastor's finger tighten on the trigger. "No!" Frank threw himself forward, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. The rifle fired again, but Frank's momentum carried him into Thornfield, sending them both tumbling across the muddy ground. Pain exploded through Frank's left shoulder as the bullet found its mark. He felt the familiar burning sensation of gunshot trauma, muscle and bone fragmenting under the impact. But adrenaline kept him moving, kept him fighting for the weapon that could end this nightmare once and for all. They rolled through the mud and leaves, 2 old men locked in a struggle that felt biblical in its intensity. Thornfield fought with the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose, while Frank fought with the protective fury of a father who had already lost too much. "You're bleeding out, old man," Thornfield hissed, as they grappled for control of the rifle. "Just like you bled out your family drop by drop with your selfishness." Frank's vision was starting to gray around the edges, but he managed to get his good hand around the rifle's barrel. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched it away from Thornfield and sent it spinning across the clearing. Sheriff Watson was there immediately, his handcuffs clicking into place around Thornfield's wrists. The pastor had finally stopped fighting, his energy spent. He lay in the mud, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the present moment. "It's over, David," Sheriff Watson said, his voice gentle despite everything that had happened. "It's finally over." But Frank knew it wasn't over. Not really. He was losing blood fast, and the gray edges of his vision were expanding toward the center. More importantly, he could see Jenny May standing 20 feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the man who was both her savior and the father who had abandoned her. Liberty limped over to Frank, favoring her left rear leg where Thornfield had kicked her during the struggle. She lay down beside him, pressing her warm body against his uninjured side. Her amber eyes were worried but alert. She was protecting him even now, even when she was hurt herself. "Frank, stay with me," Sheriff Watson was saying, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I've called for an ambulance, but this rain is going to slow them down." "You need to keep talking to me." Frank tried to focus on the sheriff's face, but his attention kept drifting to Jenny May. She had moved closer now, close enough that he could see the battle between love and hurt playing out in her expression. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered, not sure if he was talking to his daughter or to Liberty or to the ghost of Sarah Campbell. "I'm so sorry for all of it." Jenny May knelt beside him then, her hands hovering over his wound as if she wanted to help but didn't know how. "Why didn't you come for me? After my mother died, why didn't you come?" Frank tried to summon the strength to answer, to find words that could bridge 47 years of absence. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I convinced myself you were better off without me." "That wasn't your choice to make," Jenny May said, but her voice was soft now, not angry. "You robbed us both of a lifetime together." "I know." Frank could feel his strength ebbing like tide going out. "I know, and I can't fix it, but Jenny May—" He reached out with his good hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. "I want you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Not a single day." Liberty whined softly, pressing closer to Frank as if she could hold him to this world through sheer determination. The German Shepherd had already lost one handler to war. She wasn't going to lose another without a fight. The rain was starting to let up, but Frank could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. He hoped the ambulance would reach them in time, but he needed to say something while he still could. "The ranch," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "It's yours now. Has been yours all along, really. And Liberty. She chose you just like she chose me. Take care of each other." Jenny May's tears were falling freely now, mixing with the rain that still dripped from her hair. "You're not dying, you stubborn old man. You're going to live, and we're going to figure out how to be a family. We're going to have all those conversations we should have had years ago." Frank wanted to believe her, wanted to think that redemption was possible even for someone who had spent almost 5 decades running from his responsibilities. But the darkness was creeping in from all sides now, and he could feel his grip on consciousness slipping. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Liberty's face, her intelligent eyes reflecting a promise that she would protect Jenny May no matter what happened to him. It was a comfort that he carried with him into the darkness, the knowledge that his daughter would not be alone. Behind them, Pastor David Thornfield sat in Sheriff Watson's patrol car, staring out at the scene of devastation he had created. The rain had washed the last of his dignity away, leaving only a broken man who had confused power with righteousness and destroyed everything he claimed to love. The sirens were very close now, bringing with them the possibility of salvation or the certainty of loss. Only time would tell which one would claim victory in the muddy clearing where 3 generations of pain had finally come face to face. 3 days later, Frank opened his eyes to the sterile white ceiling of Harmony Valley General Hospital. The beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell told him he was alive, though the throbbing pain in his left shoulder suggested it had been a close thing. His throat felt like sandpaper, and when he tried to speak, only a croak emerged. A movement beside his bed caught his attention. Liberty lay on a makeshift bed of hospital blankets, her left rear leg wrapped in bandages. Someone had smuggled her into the ICU, which meant either the medical staff had hearts of gold or his daughter had inherited his stubborn streak. "She wouldn't leave," a familiar voice said from the corner of the room. Jenny May sat in a plastic chair that looked like it had been slept in for days. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, but her green eyes were alert and focused on his face. "The doctors tried to make her go to the veterinary clinic, but she planted herself right outside your room and refused to move. Finally, Dr. Hayes said she could stay if someone took responsibility for her." Frank's voice was barely a whisper when he finally managed to speak. "You stayed. Where else would I go?" Jenny May moved her chair closer to the bed. "I just found my father. I'm not losing him before we have a chance to talk." The weight of those words settled between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Frank had spent 47 years imagining this conversation, but in his mind it had always been with a child, not with the strong, capable woman sitting beside him. "How long have I been out?" 3 days. You lost a lot of blood, and the bullet nicked an artery. They had to do surgery twice to get all the fragments out." Jenny May's voice was matter-of-fact, but Frank could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Sheriff Watson said you threw yourself in front of a rifle to save Liberty. That was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Frank admitted. "Is Thornfield?" "In custody, charged with kidnapping, child sexual abuse, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The FBI is involved now because they found evidence that he'd been trading children with other predators across state lines. Jenny May's voice hardened. Tommy wasn't the only child who died because of what he knew. There were others over the years, kids who tried to speak up and had accidents or suddenly moved away with their families. Frank felt sick, and not just from the pain medication. How many? They're still investigating. But Lucy Morrison isn't the only current victim. 3 other children have come forward since the news broke, and there are probably more who aren't ready to talk yet. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of all the conversations they'd never had. Frank studied his daughter's face, seeing Sarah in the curve of her jaw, but also seeing something uniquely hers, a strength that came from surviving on her own, from building a life without the father who should have been there. "I need to explain," Frank said finally, "about your mother, about why I never came for you." Jenny May was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Liberty's head. "I've been thinking about that for 3 days. Part of me wants to be angry, wants to scream at you for all the birthdays and Christmas mornings and school plays you missed. But the other part of me understands. Understands what? That you were 19 years old and scared out of your mind. That you'd seen things in Vietnam that most people can't even imagine. That when you came home you probably felt like you were more danger than help to anyone who got close to you." Frank felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "I told myself you were better off without me. I convinced myself that a damaged soldier would only hurt you and your mother." "And maybe you were right," Jenny May said quietly. "Maybe if you'd stayed, my mother would have tried to fix you instead of building her own life. Maybe I would have grown up with a father who drank too much and had nightmares every night. But maybe you would have grown up with a father who loved you enough to get help. A father who would have been there when your mother died, who would have made sure you never felt abandoned." Jenny May was crying now, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I used to make up stories about you when I was little. Sometimes you were a spy who had to disappear to keep us safe. Sometimes you were an astronaut on a secret mission. I always made you the hero because I couldn't bear to think that my father just didn't want me." Frank tried to reach for her hand, but the IV line pulled taut. Jenny May saw his struggle and moved closer, taking his good hand in both of hers. "I did want you," he said, his voice breaking. "Every single day, I wanted you. But wanting and being capable of being a good father are 2 different things. I was broken, Jenny May. So broken that I couldn't see past my own pain to reach for the one thing that might have saved me." "What was that?" "You. The chance to be something better than what the war made me." Liberty raised her head then, looking between Frank and Jenny May as if she understood the significance of the moment. She struggled to her feet despite her injured leg and positioned herself so that she was touching both of them, a living bridge between father and daughter. "She brought us together," Jenny May said, scratching behind Liberty's ears. "Somehow she knew we belonged to each other." Frank thought about that, about how Liberty had appeared at his ranch just when he needed her most, how she'd led him to that cabin with such determination. Dogs see things we miss. They understand pack bonds that we've forgotten how to recognize. "Speaking of pack bonds," Jenny May said, her voice taking on a lighter tone, "the whole town has been asking about you. Clara from the diner has brought enough casseroles to feed an army. Sheriff Watson stops by twice a day. Even some of your old army buddies have called. Apparently word got out about what happened." Frank was surprised. He'd lived such an isolated life for so long that he'd forgotten people might actually care about him. "And there's something else," Jenny May continued. "The school board met yesterday. They offered me a permanent position as head of the new child safety program they're implementing." They want someone who understands trauma, who can help kids feel safe enough to speak up when something's wrong. That's wonderful. You'll be perfect for that. I told them I'd think about it. The position would require me to stay in Harmony Valley permanently. Frank understood the implication. She was asking if she had a reason to stay, if there was a relationship here worth building. "The ranch is yours," he said. "I meant what I said in the woods. It should have been yours all along. I don't want the ranch because I inherited it. I want to know if I can share it with my father." The question hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Frank thought about all the years he'd wasted, all the conversations they'd never had, all the ways he'd failed her. But he also thought about the second chance, sitting right in front of him, waiting for his answer. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that very much." Jenny May smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. For a moment, he could see the little girl she'd been, the child he'd never known, and the woman she'd become despite his absence. "There's one condition," she said, her smile turning mischievous. "Liberty comes with the package. I'm pretty sure she's decided she's our dog now, not just yours." Frank looked down at the German shepherd who was watching their conversation with those intelligent amber eyes. "I think Liberty's been our dog all along. We just needed to find each other first." Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over the mountains of Tennessee, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. It was the first sunset Frank had seen in years that felt like a beginning instead of an ending. They still had a long way to go. There would be difficult conversations ahead, years of missed time that could never be recovered, and the slow work of building trust between two people who had every reason to give up on each other. But they had something to build on now, a shared understanding of loss and survival, a mutual love for the dog who had brought them together, and the kind of second chance that most people only dream about. As the monitors beeped steadily and Liberty settled back onto her makeshift bed, Frank closed his eyes and allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible even for old soldiers who had spent too many years running from home. 6 months later, the Whitmore Ranch looked like a different place entirely. Fresh white paint gleamed on the farmhouse, new fencing enclosed pastures where rescued horses grazed peacefully, and a hand-carved sign at the entrance read, "Second Chances Ranch, Healing for Heroes and Their Companions." Frank stood on the front porch, watching Jenny May lead a group therapy session in the newly converted barn. Through the open doors, he could see 6 veterans sitting in a circle, each with a therapy dog lying quietly at their feet. Liberty, fully recovered from her injury, supervised from her favorite spot near the door, her amber eyes alert and watchful. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first weeks after the hospital had been filled with awkward conversations and careful navigation around 47 years of missed history. Frank had to learn about the woman his daughter had become, while Jenny May had to reconcile the father she'd imagined with the complicated reality of the man before her. They'd started with simple things. Jenny May teaching Frank how to use email so he could see photos from her childhood that her grandmother had saved. Frank showing her the box of letters he'd written but never sent, one for every birthday and Christmas she'd missed. They'd cried together over what was lost and celebrated what could still be found. The ranch's financial situation had improved dramatically when Jenny May used her savings and a therapy dog program grant to transform the property into something meaningful. What had started as Frank's private attempt to heal from his own demons had grown into a community resource that served veterans throughout the Tennessee mountains. Dr. Margaret Hayes, the psychologist who supervised their program, emerged from the barn and walked toward the porch. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd specialized in trauma therapy for 2 decades, and she'd been instrumental in helping Frank understand that healing wasn't a destination but a daily choice. "How's the new group doing?" Frank asked as she climbed the steps. "Better than expected. Tommy Rodriguez is still struggling with nightmares, but he's starting to trust his dog enough to let her sleep in his room, and Maria Santos actually smiled today when her shepherd brought her the tennis ball." Frank nodded, remembering his own early days with Liberty, when her presence had been more comfort than he'd wanted to admit. "It takes time." "Speaking of time," Dr. Hayes said, settling into one of the porch chairs, "I had an interesting conversation with Sheriff Watson yesterday. The trial starts next month." Frank's jaw tightened. Pastor Thornfield's case had become a media sensation, drawing national attention to the small town of Harmony Valley. The investigation had uncovered a network of abuse that spanned decades and involved several other religious leaders across the Southeast. Thornfield himself remained in federal custody, awaiting trial on charges that could put him away for life. Jenny May ready for that? As ready as anyone can be to testify against their kidnapper. But she's stronger than you think, Frank. Stronger than she thinks, too. Frank knew that was true. His daughter had surprised him repeatedly over the past 6 months with her resilience and determination. She'd not only survived her ordeal but had channeled her experience into helping others. The child safety program she'd developed for the school district was already being replicated in other counties. The sound of laughter drew their attention back to the barn. Jenny May was demonstrating something with Liberty, and the group of veterans was actually smiling. It was a sight that never failed to move Frank, the gradual return of joy to faces that had carried too much pain for too long. "She's good at this," Dr. Hayes observed. "Natural empathy combined with professional training, the dogs respond to her almost as well as they do to you." Frank felt a surge of pride. "She gets that from her mother. Sarah always had a way with wounded things." A pickup truck rumbled up the gravel drive, and Frank recognized Sheriff Watson's vehicle. Bobby had become a regular visitor to the ranch, partly in his official capacity as the case against Thornfield developed, but mostly as a friend who appreciated what they were building here. Sheriff Watson climbed out of his truck with a manila envelope in his hand. His expression was serious but not grim. "Frank, Jenny May around. Got some news about the trial. In the barn with the therapy group. Should I get her?" "Might be best." "This affects both of you." Frank called out to Jenny May, who handed Liberty's leash to one of the veterans and walked over to join them. She'd cut her hair shorter since moving to the ranch, and the physical work had given her a lean strength that reminded Frank of Sarah. "What's the news, Bobby?" she asked, settling onto the porch railing. Sheriff Watson opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. "Thornfield's lawyers approached the prosecutor yesterday. He wants to make a deal." Frank felt his muscles tense. "What kind of deal?" "Full confession to all charges in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty. He's also agreed to cooperate in the investigation of the other men in his network and to provide locations where evidence might be buried." Jenny May was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What does that mean for the trial?" "It means you wouldn't have to testify if you don't want to. The confession covers everything. Your kidnapping, the abuse of the children, even Tommy's death. He's admitting to it all." "Why now?" Frank asked. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Sheriff Watson's expression was grim. 3 more of his victims came forward last week. Kids who are adults now, ready to tell their stories. His lawyers know they can't win at trial, and Thornfield himself seems to have had some kind of breakdown. According to his psychiatrist, he's been talking about facing judgment and accepting God's punishment. Jenny May stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the pastures where horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Liberty had finished her demonstration and was trotting toward the house, her tail wagging as she spotted her people gathered together. "I want to testify anyway," Jenny May said finally. "Not for him, but for all the children who never got the chance to speak up. For Tommy. For Lucy Morrison and the others." Frank felt another surge of pride mixed with protective concern. "You don't have to put yourself through that, honey. The confession is enough to put him away forever." "It's not about punishment." Jenny May turned back to face them. "It's about truth, about standing up and saying what happened, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Testifying can be part of the healing process for some survivors, but only if you're doing it for yourself, not because you feel obligated. I'm doing it for that 5-year-old girl who tried to tell her teacher that something bad was happening at church. I'm doing it for every child who was told to keep secrets that were destroying them." Sheriff Watson folded the documents back into the envelope. "I'll let the prosecutor know. The trial is still scheduled for next month, with or without the plea deal." After Sheriff Watson left, Frank and Jenny May sat together on the porch as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Liberty lay between them, her head resting on Frank's boot, while Jenny May scratched behind her ears. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Jenny May said as the last therapy group members drove away. "What's that?" "Thanksgiving. It's next week, and I've never hosted a real family dinner. I was thinking we could invite Dr. Hayes, Sheriff Watson, maybe some of the veterans who don't have anywhere else to go." Frank smiled. The idea of filling the old farmhouse with laughter and conversation appealed to him more than he could say. "Your mother would have liked that. She always said home was wherever people felt safe enough to be themselves." "Then it's settled." "Our first official family holiday." Jenny May paused, then added quietly, "I love you, Dad." The words hit Frank like a gift he'd never expected to receive. "I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." As darkness settled over the ranch, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The pain of the past would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They'd found each other, built something meaningful together, and created a place where healing was possible. Liberty stirred at his feet, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out toward the tree line where this had all begun. For a moment, Frank could swear he saw her nod, as if she was satisfied with what they'd accomplished. Sometimes the best families were the ones you chose, the ones that found each other when they needed it most. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those families included a faithful dog who knew the way home even when you'd forgotten it yourself. Dear friends, Frank and Jenny May's story reminds us that it's never too late to come home to the people who matter most. Like many of us who served our country or lived through difficult times, Frank carried shame and regret that kept him from the very love that could have healed him. But at 68, he discovered something profound. Our deepest wounds often become the source of our greatest purpose. The ranch that once symbolized his isolation became a sanctuary where broken veterans and loyal dogs find healing together. Jenny May learned that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can transform the future. Their Thanksgiving table, filled with chosen family and grateful hearts, proves that the best chapters of our lives can be written in our later years. Whether you're carrying regret about relationships, struggling with loneliness, or wondering if your pain can ever serve a purpose, remember that redemption has no expiration date. Sometimes the family we need finds us through the most unexpected paths, even through a faithful dog who knows the way home when we've forgotten it ourselves. What relationship in your life needs a second chance, and what's one small step you could take today to bridge that gap? Have you ever experienced an animal that seemed to understand exactly what you needed when you needed it most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.